Hello, and welcome back to Sounding Cinema, where we explore how music and sound transform our relationship to film. My name is Nathan Platte, and I teach music and film history at the University of Iowa. This is the first of 2 episodes devoted to exploring this question. What exactly happens when musicians accompany a silent film in a live setting? To understand this better, we first talk about what it's like to attend a show where we can hear guitarist extraordinaire Marc Ribot respond in real time to a crazy science fiction film from the 1920s. In our next episode, I'll talk to musicians who created brand new music for a very old film for local audiences right here in Iowa. I am thrilled to have 3 Iowa students joining me on this first conversation. Luke Hine is majoring in music and economics, Will Sinak is majoring in cinema and screenwriting, and Abbie McLaren is majoring in cinema and journalism. Luke, Will, and Abbie are going to set the stage for our conversation now.
What sounds come to mind when someone mentions silent film? You probably think of silence. And that's why silent film as a term is pretty misleading. Yes, these films don't carry a synchronized soundtrack, but their so-called silence was filled by performers who added to the films as they were being shown to audiences. Which means there's an entire world of not-so-silent stories out there just waiting to be rediscovered. And you don't have to be a film buff, a music aficionado, or a historian to consume these stories and have a great time at the theater while you do it. Now, silent film and exciting might not be words that you'd normally put together, and there does seem to be a bit of a greater barrier of entry when it comes to silent cinema. We are much more used to seeing and hearing film. On-screen storytelling without characters' voices can seem like a big loss. But good live accompaniment to silent films creates such an immersive and engaging experience that it feels just as exhilarating to experience as a film from the 21st century. At least, that was the case for us when we attended Marc Ribot's performance to the 1924 silent film, Aelita, Queen of Mars.
The heyday of silent film stretches from the 1890s through the 1920s, and in many instances, a piano player would accompany viewings, often using improvisation to follow the film's story. Eventually, this would expand in some theaters to something as large as a full orchestra. Ribot's performance is an extension and twist on that much older practice, and he's part of a large number of musicians who play new music to films that are over 100 years old. Rather than watching a silent film with a pre-recorded score, the prospect of having an in-house performance in real time offers a unique experience at each individual showing. The unpredictable nature of live musical performances brings a new dimension to what could otherwise be looked at as your everyday movie-going experience. It's raw and often reactive, bringing an energy that a pre-recorded version cannot offer. FilmScene, our local nonprofit cinema in Iowa City, hosted its 3rd annual Refocus Film Festival in October of this year. The festival focuses on the art of adaptation, and that definition is broad. Films are adapted from a number of mediums: books, music, people's lives. At the festival, Luke, Abbie, and Professor Platte were lucky enough to attend a screening of Aelita, Queen of Mars, a 1924 Soviet science fiction film adapted from a novel written the year before.
Marc Ribot is an American noise guitarist with a background in jazz and roots music. His recordings, both solo and with his trio Ceramic Dog, have landed on various best-of lists, and he has recorded with a plethora of award-winning musicians. Ribot has also performed on contemporary film scores, with credits including The Kids Are All Right, Where the Wild Things Are, and The Departed, and occasionally performs a live guitar score to Charlie Chaplin's The Kid. Ribot first wrote music for Aelita in the 90s. That version involved a group of musicians, but later Ribot adapted the work into a semi-improvised score for solo guitar, which he performs now. Aelita, Queen of Mars was made in the early years of the Soviet Union, and it shows. Old melodramatic plot twists are dressed up in visions of new revolutionary worlds. In the film, an engineer named Los receives a strange message on wireless transmission and daydreams that it came from Mars. He imagines a class-divided aristocratic society full of sharp angles, strange costumes, and brutalist sets. Eventually, we see Los voyage to Mars, where he assists in a workers' revolt and has to make a tough decision about Aelita when she attempts to reclaim power. For the film festival screening, Ribot made his own cut of the film. By shortening the film from 2 hours to about 1, Ribot cut some of the film's subplots and turned down some of the Soviet propaganda in order to foreground the film's fascination with interplanetary adventure.
In the next section, we're going to talk about what it was like to be in the theater and hear Ribot's music for Aelita, Queen of Mars, live. The liveness matters. Yes, it can be fascinating to watch a silent film online with recorded music. But what is it like when the musician is in the room with you, reacting to the movie, and helping the audience react in turn? What are the ways in which Ribot's music grabs or deflects our attention as Aelita's story unfolds? In what ways can Ribot's guitar-spun soundscapes draw us deeper into the story and, paradoxically, make us aware, and perhaps more fascinated, by the 100 years that separate us from the people on screen? Will sets up our first question, and then you'll hear from Abbie, Luke, and me. We can't share Ribot's music as it was heard during the Refocus Festival performance, but to share some of Ribot's musical spirit, we have included some clips from his Aelita suite, written for a small ensemble, and some tracks from his solo album, the aptly titled Silent Movies. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
The first question I was interested in asking is how does the performed music interact with filmic language on screen? So in terms of camera movement or cutting, so how do those two interact?
Marc Ribot, the performer, is down sort of in front of the seats, sort of positioned so he's facing the screen. And this setup of the room made a lot of sense to me as to how I interpreted the music responding to the film, which was that when I was watching it, I felt like the music was responding to cuts, not necessarily in sync with cuts, but as if, we see a cut, we see a scene change, and then there's a moment and then the music changes. It's really reacting to what's happening rather than being synced up with what's happening. It's really clear to me that it's something that's happening live rather than something that's pre-recorded because of that quality. And I think us learning that a lot of Ribot's live score was improvisation makes a lot of sense for that too, because even though he's done, this performance several times, he still has to react. He's coming up with things in the moment. He's reacting to what's happening in the film rather than playing something that has been memorized.
He mentioned that he had a few ideas, specific beats that he wanted to hit, and then the rest was that improvisation, just filling it in. And there were definitely moments that felt predetermined where he had a musical idea that reflected what was happening really in tunely with what was going on screen. There were a few times where it was kind of the classical film old school film idea where there's like some kind of reveal and then the music does a little ding to show that there's, oh, this is a reveal. It's,
just like a stinger chord or something.
Yes. Yeah, with like some kind of seventh or something on top that gives it that, hey, there it is.
I think that's a good point, that there were some moments that felt more in sync. I think it was really like specific moments throughout the film. I had a couple that stuck out to me, and one was with the accordion being played. It sort of sounded like there was this preconceived song that's sort of being played in that moment that I think is, I would guess it's something that he plays the same for each time he does this performance. I don't know, but it sounded like something that was maybe come up with beforehand. And another example I had was when the bombs go off towards the end of the film. There's like these big, loud, like power chords he's playing. And I thought that was an interesting moment in the score because I felt like it was mimicking a sound effect rather than like providing a score, sort of mimicking like an explosion sound rather than just like being accompanying music. And that was another moment that I felt was like a little more sort of in sync with what was going on screen. But I would say for the majority of the rest, it felt like sort of responding.
That moment with the accordion is something I had noted as well, because I would even argue most of the accompaniment was amelodic, or at least you could make that argument. But it was very clear when there was the images of a musician playing. He switched into like a straight up melody, and it was out of place with the rest of the score. It really called attention to something different that was happening.
There's something really neat about that, I think, where, when we are watching this with Marc Ribot, we are thinking about, to a certain extent, his own style, right? He's not trying to sound like a musician from 1920s Soviet Union. He's not trying to just sort of create a sort of generic score. He is bringing his very specific artistic language to this experience. And being a noise guitarist means a lot of what he's doing is about tone color, and it is about, these really big sort of gestures that are kind of almost like sound effects, or sort of more interesting for their sonic qualities than for like their melodic qualities. So yeah, just what you were saying, Luke, that moment where we see music in a sort of more traditional kind of like music is something that has a melody and a rhythm represented on the screen. He's like, oh yeah, I can do that too. But that's not like what most of this experience is about. It's more like sort of sound art, like you were saying, Abbie, reacting to what's happening on the screen.
Going off of this idea of like improvisation and kind of the expectations that you had going into this, did you notice at all as an audience how you all were responding to the more unexpected musical aspects and how that translates to the screen? Did you notice that audience members were maybe surprised or reacted in a way that you weren't expecting?
Well, I would answer that by bringing up a quote that I wish I would have written down immediately when he said it, but I have the general idea. But afterwards, when there was a brief Q&A, Marc Ribot said something along the lines of, film sound is doing its job when you don't consciously register that it's there. And he said it a little bit more eloquently than that. I can't remember the exact wording, but it was clear that was an intention of his, that he wanted the film to be the focus, almost as if it were a traditional modern film, and the music the score was there, but you didn't notice that it was really live, and that it would complement the film. And I didn't feel like that for about the first 45 minutes of the film. But then something happened, and I can't really describe it about 30, 45 minutes in where he really did. He faded in the background, and I became fully locked in on the film. And what he was doing was complementing that. It was registering in the back of my mind, but I never thought about, hey, there's a live performer here doing this.
It didn't really seem like anyone was like peering over their seats to see Ribot down there in the corner, and I wasn't doing that either. Like, I couldn't see him from my seat, so I feel like that really, led me to stay focused on the screen. I would say, you said, Luke, that maybe like 30, 45 minutes in, you really fell into this like state of, just hearing it as a score. And I think maybe part of that for me, I would say most of the film, I wasn't super aware of like the live aspect of the score. Like I was really kind of in it, but I would say like the sequences that take place on Mars really immersed me maybe more, perhaps because I really found the like production design of Mars to reflect Ribot's like guitar sounds really well. He said this too in the Q&A after. He talked about Aelita, Queen of Mars being a film that really kind of looked like how he sounded stylistically. And for those reasons, I think being on Mars really immersed me a little bit more. And then sort of when you get those cuts, those transitions from Mars to Earth, and then those reactionary style changes where the guitar gets a little softer, I don't know all the technical terms for guitar, but it feels a little bit, maybe he's using like less of his distortion techniques and things like that when you get back to Earth, and it's a little more like folksy is the wrong word, but if you can have like more folksy noise guitar, maybe that's like where you're going, and sort of those transitions are maybe what like takes me out of it a little bit.
The idea that this is really a unique experience and that it's never going to be exactly this way again, I think it's hard to just sort of like let that fall in the background, at least initially. And so there is that element of almost like kind of spectator uncertainty, like how much should I be paying attention to this special thing that's happening? This guy who's off in the corner, like working really hard, like isn't that kind of like why we're here? And it is interesting how some of his decisions sort of reflect that. Like there is this, to me, it felt like the music was more sort of distantly remarking upon this film and sort of its strangeness to audiences now. And that when we get to that last, say, third of the film where we have these battle sequences and there's social upheaval and, people are fighting for the people's revolution on Mars. So I guess the Martians' revolution. That kind of allows, that sort of narrative sweep allows us to kind of go, oh, okay, no, now we're really going to focus on this. And he's just going to sort of churn away musically with that, which is appropriate. It's kind of this balancing act where for the beginning, it's like, okay, we're really here for Marc Ribot. And at the end, we're like, oh, we really want to see what happens with this. Like, are the Martians going to win or not? And so the music kind of takes a little bit of a back seat, perhaps.
A follow-up I would have is we have all watched at least two different versions of this, one being the pre-recorded one and one being a live version. And when looking at a film that has been scored in multiple ways, I was wondering if Ribot spoke on the approach in making unique and making an original this specific version of the accompaniment to the movie.
I guess I said this before, but Ribot talked a little bit about how Aelita's visual aesthetic kind of resembled his personal style. I was doing a little bit of reading about Ribot and maybe what his personal style is, and some words I came across were experimental post-rock noise. He also has histories in jazz and roots music, so I was like, there's a lot there that he can, pull from in terms of personal style. So in terms of creating an original sound, I think, Ribot's original sound sort of stems from all these different experiences he's had in creating music and not necessarily from anything in the film, it almost feels like, even though the film was created in 1924, it's sort of something that can be added on to his sound that is pre-established rather than him sort of like creating a sound to match the movie. Talking about all these different sort of musical experiences he's had across his life, I was also thinking it would be interesting to see how an artist without that kind of developed personal style, or maybe with a less niche personal style, would respond to a film like Aelita.
Yeah, well, part of it for sure is that this wasn't an accompaniment pulled out of 1920s. It was almost like the film he chose to complement his own style. They went so hand in hand together with the creating this otherworldly aspect of the film. And another performer could have, to speak to your question, another performer certainly could have had a wildly different take. Maybe they wanted to be more historically accurate. Maybe they wanted to have their sound directly reflect everything that happened on screen. I think his experimental aspect, though, was a great fit. So I was super happy with what he produced for us.
Yeah, it's neat to think about how the edit of the film that we were watching was his edit, and we've talked about how there are sort of different edits of the film out there, and its full-length version is almost 2 hours. The version we watched was just a little over an hour, so almost half the full film was gone. But what he tended to cut were the scenes set on Earth, and so really what ends up happening is we just spend a lot more time on Mars, and that kind of goes back to your point, Abbie, about the film sort of already being in the sort of visual corollary of Marc Ribot's sound. And I think the through line is the sort of experimental or modernist aesthetic of, Mars looks the way that modernist and expressionist art of the, early part of the 20th century looks. And so there's this kind of like, we use this art to imagine a future society, something, really different from what we experience in day-to-day life. That's what Mars is going to look like. And Ribot is doing something differently much later in the 20th and early 21st century, but it's still, you mentioned like post-rock and experimental, right? There's this sense of like what comes after the thing that we're doing now. What is the sort of thing that really sort of shocks us in some kind of way to sort of think differently about music, or about what a guitar should sound like, or what this kind of music should inspire.
That made me think of another thing. One of my favorite film composers is Hans Zimmer, and I love sci-fi films, of which he has scored many. And he has said something along the lines of, when the images on screen are not of this world, then in his opinion, the sounds should reflect that. They shouldn't be. And John Williams has a different approach. John Williams has a classic orchestral, big, melodic approach to scoring his sci-fi films. But I'd say Ribot is much more in that Zimmer vein of sounds that don't sound like they're from this world, because why would the sounds of Mars sound like ours on Earth? It doesn't make as much sense.
I don't know if futurist is the right word, but it sounds very much like something that is, from what is to come. It is not of right now.
If we put ourselves back in the 20s, and really a film composer came along and wanted to score this film and had the great idea, hey, Mars, I could make this sound futuristic because it's a different world. That composer might have tried to make something sound like music from 100 years in the future, which is exactly what we got to experience, because we did hear music that was of our time, which is 100 years in the future of when the film was made. So that idea is kind of cool to me.
We're seeing like what the future looked like to the past, which is kind of, just a really interesting thing to experience. And you can do this with sound film, right? You can go and watch science fiction from the 50s and 60s and sort of see like what did they think the future sounded like, and it's different from how we imagine the future sounding today. And so what seems to be kind of happening here is a bit of bridge building where Ribot is not trying to is not trying to put us into the 1920s. He's trying to sort of capture the spirit of what might have been in the artists' minds in the 1920s of something, really, really out of the ordinary that kind of excites the imagination.
I did want to talk just a little bit about what we saw on screen and how the crowd reacted and the experience of being there, because like we talked about, I was interested in seeing, is the crowd going to be interested in watching this performer? Are they going to be watching it more like a traditional film? How into that are they going to be? And as it turned out, it was very much about the film, very little about Ribot calling attention to himself. And the things that happened on screen, there were big pops.
Yes.
It was awesome. I mean, it was like a massive laugh and I died laughing when the hammer and the it's like a scythe, the Soviet sign came on screen. It was because I had not seen the full film up to that point, so to me that came out of nowhere. And once I realized what was going on with this Soviet propaganda or whatnot, man, that really just that increased my engagement. It was so funny, and the crowd was laughing. They were so into it, like I wouldn't have expected from a 20s silent film.
Yeah, that was really neat. I agree that those moments of the audience responding to like, there is some overtly propagandistic parts to this film, and what do we do with that? Because I think it really, in some ways, pulls us out of the story because we're just not used to that kind of address in most of our film. It also helps put us into the era that it's from. And, the Soviet Union is a very young country. And what I thought was neat was for those passages, Ribot actually, he starts quoting the Internationale, which is just, it's the communist anthem. And so to have this really, really straightforward melody, and I think if people recognized it as the communist anthem, it would sort of further the humor, because it's like, yeah, I see it too kind of thing. But even if you don't, there's still that sense of like, this is like, here's this like straightforward kind of melody that is, cheering on the Martians in their righteous cause, but also feels really out of step with the rest of both the film and also Ribot's music. So I felt like that was kind of a neat way of sort of managing that. I think if he had just sort of continued playing in a way that was more of a piece of his style, we might have said, hey, like, did he notice that like that guy just made the communist emblem and we just had to watch that for reasons that don't seem to be like super urgent to the story itself. And so I thought that was really, really fun.
Knowing about those references, I would love to see what his like notes looked like, or if he had like an outline of the film, or where he was going to put sort of what pieces that are sort of preconceived. I would love to see how he outlined that for himself.
Yeah, it's actually that part of it is very sort of historically appropriate. I don't know that that's why he would have done it, but a lot of silent film music was pastiche. It was just putting together pieces of music that already existed, because you could either bank on people recognizing the melodies and sometimes like filling in the words, or at the very least, it was a way to rapidly make a musical accompaniment if you're just trying to fill up space, right? It's easier to take music that's already out there than write new music. So it would be, like you were saying, Abbie, it would be really interesting to know, does he always do that when he accompanies it? And how much do those references change or not change each time he plays it? Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the actual sounds he was making on the guitar. There was one point where it was it was like a slide chord. So he like is on a chord and he like pew, like it really slides down and up. And I also thought he was doing just a lot of interesting making a lot of percussive sounds through the electric guitar, whether that was like I wish I could have seen him for this to figure out more of what he was doing on his guitar. But maybe like when I was a kid, like I used to run a pick on the string of the guitar, and it was like breaking out of jail. Like I don't know. It sounded like he was doing some of that sort of thing. So I just wondered what everyone made out of like the sounds he was making.
It's very funny to me that you bring that up, because I had the exact same experience of noticing some sounds that he was making, but having not even an ounce of the technical guitar knowledge to put that to articulate that, to put that into words. There was another sound that he made frequently, and I could never tell if there was a specific reason. I'm sure there was, but it seemed to me almost random, and it was a unique guitar sound. It was like it's like he moved his left hand all the way to the top, and it was really jumbled, like this really crunchy, almost like major second chords just stacked on top of each other, so that there's a bunch of tones all in a small space. And with the electric guitar, it was just this like really guttural, crunchy chord that in kind of a higher register that he did several times. I couldn't really describe what that is. I couldn't describe it in guitar terms what he was doing, but they were really cool sounds.
I agree with you. I had lots of follow-up questions about that, and I really liked that it sort of falls in a long history in science fiction of blurring sound effects with music, and kind of sound effects sound more musical in science fiction oftentimes, and oftentimes the music sounds more sound effect-y because it has oftentimes synthesizers in it or instruments being played in unusual ways, like what he was doing with his guitar. And so there was that sound that for me was like the laser sound, and I don't mean that like it accompanied a laser in the film. It just sounded the way that I think lasers sound, because that's the way they sound in sci-fi films from like the 50s and stuff. And it was an extended sort of chord or sonority, but that was dynamic. He was like sort of changing the pitch of it as he was sustaining it. And it seemed to often be associated with when sort of the Martians were observing things on Earth. Like it seemed to be kind of like used motivically for that.
Yeah, that is the one I was talking about.
Okay.
Because that's when it happened, was when the first time they like saw Earth.
Yeah. And so it's neat that, again, like here's this thing that we totally can't describe with words, but we are recognizing, and he's using it motivically because he brings it back, and it's not exactly a sound effect. It doesn't have any like clear corollary to like some kind of motion on screen, but it does seem to be tied to this particular, Mars-Earth connection. But then he used it once or twice when it was not that. And I was totally thrown by that. I was like, wait, is this like, do I have to revise what this sound means? Or did he just drop it in because he felt like it? Or does this have some sort of deeper meaning? That's kind of the beauty of motifs is they can be really specific, and we can feel super confident that we know what they mean, and then an artist can kind of destabilize that just by using it in another place, and we have to go, oh, well, maybe it means something other than what I thought it meant.
I think that aspect of hearing all these different sounds did make me think about the score more than maybe he would have hoped, just because I was wondering what he was doing and how he was making these noises, being an aspect that maybe takes you out of the film and score synchronicity that maybe he was going for.
Yeah, that whole element of, how kind of going back to the beginning of like, how aware are you supposed to be of this? I mean, I think everybody in that theater would have been disappointed if they'd gotten to the end and they were like, wow, I didn't notice the music at all, right? I mean, we were like clearly there for him. But that, again, that sort of balance of how much is the music supposed to take our attention, and not just the musical sounds, but like what you were saying, Abbie, like the physical presence of the musician. Like, how different would it have been if he had parked himself like in the middle of the screen, like right in front? He had a monitor, so he was facing the screen, but he also had a monitor in front of him. So he could have, in theory, just like plunked down right in the middle, looked at his monitor, and we could have watched him the whole time, right? And that would have been a really, really different experience for sure.
That is one thing I was wondering, is how visible he and the other musical accompaniments were to the audience, to you all. But it seems like it wasn't largely visible.
No, he tucked himself away. He really tried not to be visible. I think he wanted to be in the background. I mean, he had a bunch of equipment, so you could obviously see that there was somebody and a bunch of stuff there, but especially from if you were sitting higher up like I was, then he really was almost like he wasn't there at all.
Yeah, I think the only seats you maybe could have seen him from was like the front row, and I'm not gonna voluntarily sit in the front row of a movie theater, so
that's one thing that I think is kind of interesting about the guitar situation is, partly because he was hidden, partly because it's a guitar, there is more sort of mystique and kind of like, how is he doing what he's doing? So he wrote music for this film for an ensemble. Check it out on Spotify. But he said in the Q&A that like he kind of ditched that he ditched that score because it was just too hard to do. And that doesn't surprise me at all, because when you have an ensemble, you have to think a lot more about like this sort of synchronization element, because it's much easier to improvise as a sole person, or even a small combo. Like we've had at FilmScene, we've had a jazz trio come, and they can sort of improvise together because they're real comfortable with that, and there's 3 of them. But if you have a larger group, there has to be a pretty clear like game plan for like, okay, if we're going to play this thing together, when exactly are we going to do it, and can we match it up with the film? So I thought it was interesting. It was like, that was way too hard. So I'm going to do something where I have a lot more flexibility as a musician, and I don't have to worry about trying to coordinate all of this like in the moment in front of an audience.
I think just seeing people have such vivacious and lively reactions to a film from 1924 was really a unique experience, because I think, watching older films in classes and things like that, since we're so distanced in time, I think it's easy to feel more distance from what's happening in the film in terms of like moments of comedy, moments of drama, things you can react to out loud in a room. And I think that was probably the first time I've ever seen like such lively reactions to a film so old. I realized that this is actually the oldest film I've ever seen, like feature length. And I thought that was just really cool to see that kind of engagement with something from the past. And I think that's part of why having a live score is so cool, because it can bring that kind of contemporary audience to a piece of art that is getting older. I think that's a really good way to kind of keep the spirit of these older films alive.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Sounding Cinema. On this episode, you heard the University of Iowa students Luke Heying, Abbie McLaren, and Will Sinak. We also heard excerpts of Marc Ribot's Aelita suite from his 1997 album Shoestring Symphonettes and his 2010 album Silent Movies. We also wanted to extend a special thank you to FilmScene, who invited Marc to the Refocus Film Festival and provided us with access to a show that quickly sold out. If you live near Iowa City, check out FilmScene's programming for more silent films with live music. If you enjoyed the episode, please share the podcast with a friend or give us a review on your preferred platform. See our show notes for links to additional resources on Marc Ribot and live musical accompaniments to silent film. And please join us for our next episode when we study the experience of playing for silent film from the perspectives of the musicians. Until then, be well and happy listening.